Ma'am, hey ma'am, would you stand up for me?
Huh? What?
Go ahead and stand,
I'm
please.
just tending my flowers.
I understand. I just need to talk with you a second.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Let me get up.
Thank you. Hands where I can see, please.
Officer, what's this about? This is my house right here. I ain't been anywhere.
We'll talk about it in a moment, okay?
The boots hit gravel first. Heavy, deliberate steps moving across a driveway that didn't belong to the man wearing them. Officer Brandon Mills walked toward the front yard of 4723 Magnolia Drive with his hand already resting on his belt, his eyes fixed on the elderly black woman kneeling in the garden. Dorothy Patterson didn't hear him coming. She was focused on the begonia bulbs in her hands, pressing each one into the rich soil she'd spent decades nurturing. The afternoon sun hung heavy over Maplewood, Alabama, casting warmth across her back as she worked. She was humming an old hymn her mother had taught her 70 years ago, the melody rising and falling with each breath. "Ma'am." The word cut through her peace like a knife. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up." Dorothy looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. A police officer stood at the edge of her lawn, his shadow falling across her flower bed. Confusion crossed her face. She'd been planting flowers in this yard for 43 years. No one had ever questioned her right to be here. "Can I help you, officer?" I said stand up. His tone hardened, patience already exhausted despite the conversation being seconds old. "I need to see some identification." Dorothy rose slowly. Her knees protested after 20 minutes of kneeling, the familiar ache of 80 years reminding her that her body no longer moved the way her mind remembered. She brushed soil from her gardening gloves, taking her time, refusing to be rushed by a stranger's demands. "I'm sorry, but what is this about?" "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address," Mills said. His eyes moved past her to the house, scanning windows, calculating. "Someone gardening where they shouldn't be." Dorothy's expression shifted. The confusion remained, but something else joined it. A quiet recognition of what was actually happening here. She'd seen this moment before, many times, from many different angles over her long life. "Officer, this is my home. I've lived here since 1982. I'm going to need to see proof of that. Do you have identification on you right now?" "I'm gardening in my own front yard." Dorothy's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now, forged over decades. "I don't carry my purse when I'm planting flowers." Mills stepped closer. His hand hadn't left his belt. "Then we have a problem." Across the street, Martha Chun paused while watering her roses. She'd lived on Magnolia Drive for 15 years, and she'd waved to Dorothy nearly every morning of those 15 years. The two women had shared recipes, attended the same church fundraisers, and celebrated each other's grandchildren's graduations. Martha knew exactly who Dorothy Patterson was, and she knew exactly what she was watching unfold. 3 houses down, Marcus Williams stopped washing his car. He'd moved to the neighborhood 8 years ago, and Dorothy had been the first person to welcome him with a pound cake and a genuine smile. She told him the history of every house on the street, introduced him to neighbors, made him feel like he belonged in a place where belonging wasn't always guaranteed. The mail carrier, Jerome, slowed his truck at the corner. He'd been delivering mail to Dorothy Patterson for 12 years. He knew her handwriting on the Christmas cards she sent to her grandchildren in Atlanta. He knew the magazine subscriptions she kept. He knew she ordered flower bulbs from the same catalog every spring. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They watched and they waited, and they felt the familiar helplessness of witnessing something wrong while wearing the wrong skin to stop it. Mills had been with the Maplewood Police Department for 6 months. He'd transferred from a smaller precinct in rural Georgia, arriving with a clean record and a firm handshake. Chief Robert Hansen had welcomed him aboard without asking too many questions. The department was understaffed, and Mills had experience. That was enough. What Hansen didn't know or didn't care to discover lived in a file cabinet 600 miles away. 4 formal complaints in 18 months. 4 black men stopped for reasons that evaporated under scrutiny. 4 investigations that went nowhere because the men didn't have the resources to push back, and the department didn't have the motivation to look deeper. Mills's former captain had recommended termination. Instead, Mills had been offered a quiet exit. Resign, and the complaints stay buried. Resign, and you can start fresh somewhere else. Resign, And the pattern continues with someone else's budget and someone else's liability. So Brandon Mills resigned. And within 3 weeks, he was wearing a new badge in a new town, carrying the same assumptions that had gotten him in trouble before. He looked at Dorothy Patterson, and he saw what he always saw. A black woman in a neighborhood where, in his mind, black women didn't belong. The house was too nice. The yard was too well maintained. The street was too quiet and too prosperous for someone like her to be standing in it with soil under her fingernails. He didn't see 43 years of mortgage payments. He didn't see 2 children raised in those rooms, their heights marked on the kitchen door frame in pencil. He didn't see a husband buried from the living room, the funeral guests spilling onto the porch because so many people came to pay respects. He didn't see the garden club meetings hosted on the back patio, or the Thanksgiving dinners that filled the house with laughter, or the grandchildren who learned to ride bikes on this very sidewalk. He saw suspicion. He saw opportunity. He saw a chance to do what he believed his job required. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." Dorothy didn't move. "I will not." "Excuse me?" "I said I will not." Her voice carried the weight of authority that came from somewhere deep, somewhere practiced, somewhere this young officer couldn't begin to understand. "I am standing in my own yard, on property I have owned for 4 decades. I have committed no crime. I will not be handcuffed." Mills reached for her wrist. His fingers closed around her arm, and Dorothy pulled back instinctively. The movement was small, reflexive, the natural response of any human being to unwanted physical contact. But Mills had been waiting for it. He twisted her arm behind her back and forced her toward the ground. 80 years old, and her face pressed against the grass she'd watered that morning. The soil she'd been planting in moments ago now smeared across her cheek. Her white hair fell loose from its pins, tangled in the green blades beneath her. The handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. Martha Chin dropped her garden hose. Marcus Williams stood frozen beside his car, sponge dripping forgotten in his hand. Jerome the mail carrier reached for his phone with shaking fingers. Dorothy Patterson lay on her own lawn, arrested for trespassing on property she'd owned since Ronald Reagan's first term. The patrol car smelled like stale coffee and air freshener that couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of sweat and fear absorbed into the seats over years of transporting people to places they didn't want to go. Dorothy sat in the back, her hands cuffed behind her, her shoulders already beginning to ache from the unnatural position. Through the window, she watched her garden grow smaller as Mills pulled away from the curb. The begonias she'd been planting sat in their container on the lawn, abandoned mid-task. The trowel lay in the dirt where she dropped it. The kneeling pad she'd used to protect her aging joints remained exactly where she'd left it. 43 years in that house. 43 years of building a life, raising a family, becoming part of the fabric of a community. And now she was leaving it in the back of a police car, charged with trespassing on her own property. Mills didn't speak during the drive. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. Dorothy was cargo now, a problem to be processed and filed away. Whatever humanity she possessed had been stripped the moment he decided she didn't belong. Dorothy closed her eyes. The hymn she'd been humming before Mills arrived came back to her, the melody running through her mind like water over smooth stones. Her mother had sung it while hanging laundry on the line in rural Alabama, back when Dorothy was small enough to hide between the drying sheets. The song spoke of trouble and deliverance, of faith tested and faith rewarded. Dorothy had sung it at her mother's funeral and at her husband's funeral, and in the quiet moments when the weight of the world pressed too heavy on her shoulders. She hummed it now, softly, barely audible over the engine's drone. It was the only act of resistance available to her in this moment. They could take her freedom. They could take her dignity. But they couldn't take the song her mother gave her. At the station, Mills handed her off to the booking officer without ceremony. He recited the charges in a flat voice. Trespassing. Resisting arrest. Failure to provide identification. 3 crimes invented from nothing, manufactured from the simple act of existing in the wrong skin in the wrong place at the wrong time. The booking officer looked at Dorothy with tired eyes. He was older than Mills, with gray at his temples and the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much and stopped asking questions years ago. He processed her with mechanical efficiency, taking her fingerprints, photographing her in her soil-stained gardening clothes, asking questions she answered with quiet precision. Full name: Dorothy Mae Patterson. Address: 4723 Magnolia Drive. Date of birth: November 3, 1944. The information went into the system. The system did not flag anything unusual. Dorothy Mae Patterson became a number, a case file, a name on a booking sheet. Whatever she had been before this moment, whatever she had accomplished, whatever respect she had earned, whatever authority she had wielded, none of it existed in this room. She was placed in a holding cell. The bench was metal, cold even through her clothes. The walls were painted that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from the human spirit. A woman half Dorothy's age sat in the corner, avoiding eye contact, wrapped in her own troubles. Dorothy sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall directly across from her. She did not slump. She did not cry. She did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. 4 hours passed. 4 hours of sitting in that cell while the system ground forward at its own pace, indifferent to the woman it had swallowed. Dorothy asked for a phone call twice. Both times, she was told someone would come for her soon. No one came. Outside the holding area, Mills completed his paperwork with the confidence of a man who believed he'd done his job correctly. His report painted a clear picture: suspicious individual, unable to verify residence, became combative when asked to cooperate, resisted lawful detention. The words flowed easily because he'd written similar words before, in similar reports, about similar people who'd committed similar crimes of existing while black. He filed the report and moved on with his shift. Dorothy Patterson was already forgotten, just another entry in a log, just another body in a cell, just another number in a system designed to process people, not protect them. But systems have cracks. And sometimes, the cracks reveal truths that the people running the system would prefer to keep hidden. Sergeant Linda Vasquez was working the evening shift when she walked past the holding area on her way to the break room. She'd been with the Maplewood Police Department for 14 years, long enough to develop instincts that the younger officers hadn't yet acquired. Something made her slow down as she passed the cell where Dorothy sat. It was the posture. Vasquez had seen hundreds of people in that cell over the years. Most of them slumped. Most of them stared at the floor. Most of them radiated defeat and despair in equal measure. This woman sat like she was presiding over a courtroom, not trapped inside a cage. Vasquez stopped. She looked at Dorothy through the bars, and Dorothy looked back with eyes that held no fear, no shame, no uncertainty. Just patience. Just waiting. Something wasn't right here. Vasquez walked to the booking desk and pulled up the arrest report. The charges listed were standard enough. The narrative Mills had written seemed straightforward. But the woman's age caught her attention. 80 years old. Arrested for trespassing. In a residential neighborhood. While gardening. She ran the name again, this time cross-referencing the address. The system took a moment to search, pulling records from multiple databases, connecting dots that should have been connected hours ago. The results appeared on her screen. Vasquez read them once. She read them again. Her face went pale. Dorothy Mae Patterson. Registered property owner, 4723 Magnolia Drive, since 1982. Former presiding judge, Alabama 5th Circuit Court. Retired 2015 after 37 years on the bench. First black woman appointed to the circuit court in Alabama history. Vasquez stared at the screen, understanding flooding through her in waves. The woman sitting in that cell had spent nearly 4 decades dispensing justice from the other side of the bench. She'd written opinions cited by the state Supreme Court. She'd mentored generations of attorneys. She'd broken barriers that most people couldn't even see, let alone climb over. And she'd just spent 4 hours in a holding cell because a 6-month transfer decided she looked suspicious while planting flowers in her own garden. The cell door opened with a metallic clang that echoed off the institutional walls. Sergeant Vasquez stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and something that looked almost like shame. "Mrs. Patterson." Vasquez's voice was careful, measured. I'm so sorry. There's been a terrible mistake. Dorothy rose from the metal bench, her movements deliberate, her dignity intact despite everything. She didn't speak. She simply waited for what came next, the way she'd waited through 4 hours of unjust detention, the way she'd waited through decades of slights and indignities that came with being the first, the only, the exception in rooms that weren't built for her. The apologies came in waves. Vasquez apologized. The booking officer apologized. A lieutenant materialized from somewhere to apologize on behalf of the department. The charges were dropped before the ink on the paperwork was dry. Someone offered her coffee. Someone else offered to drive her home. Everyone suddenly remembered that Dorothy Patterson was a human being worthy of respect, now that they knew she was a human being with power. Dorothy declined the coffee. She declined the ride. She walked out of the police station into the evening air, still wearing her soil-stained gardening clothes, still carrying the weight of what had been done to her. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple as she stood on the sidewalk outside the station. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with free air, reminding her body that the nightmare was over. But even as she stood there, Dorothy knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She'd spent 37 years on the bench. She'd seen injustice from every angle, had weighed evidence and testimony and legal arguments with the precision her position demanded. She understood, better than most, how the system was supposed to work. And she understood, better than most, how catastrophically it failed when the people running it stopped seeing human beings and started seeing only categories. Officer Brandon Mills had looked at her and seen a category. But elderly. Out of place. He'd built an entire narrative from those 3 assumptions, a story so complete in his mind that reality couldn't penetrate it. She'd told him she owned the house. He didn't believe her. She'd lived there for 43 years. He didn't care. She'd refused to submit to an unjust demand. He'd called it resistance. The charges were dropped, yes. The apologies were made, certainly. But what about the next person? What about the elderly black man walking through a nice neighborhood to visit his daughter? What about the young black woman sitting in her car making a phone call before a job interview? What about all the people who would cross Brandon Mills's path and not have a 37-year judicial career to protect them? Dorothy's son arrived within the hour to take her home. Marcus Jr. was 52 now, a pediatrician in Birmingham, and when he saw his mother standing outside the police station in her gardening clothes, something in his expression shattered. He'd grown up watching her command courtrooms, watching grown men defer to her judgment, watching her navigate a world designed to minimize her at every turn. Seeing her like this, diminished by a system she devoted her life to serving, broke something in him that would take years to repair. They drove home in silence. There would be time for words later, time for anger and grief and the complicated conversations that families have when the world shows its true face. For now, Dorothy simply watched the streets of Maplewood pass by her window, the same streets she'd driven for 4 decades, suddenly feeling foreign in a way they never had before. When they arrived at 4723 Magnolia Drive, the begonias were still sitting in their container on the lawn. The trowel still lay in the dirt. The kneeling pad hadn't moved. It was as if time had frozen the moment Mills put her in his car, preserving the scene for her return. Dorothy didn't go inside right away. She walked to the garden first, to the spot where she'd been kneeling when her afternoon was interrupted. She looked down at the holes she'd dug, the bulbs she'd been about to plant, the work left unfinished by an injustice she hadn't invited and couldn't have prevented. She didn't plant the remaining bulbs that night. She wasn't ready. The garden that had been her sanctuary for decades now carried a different memory, one that would take time to integrate with all the others. But she stood there for a long moment, letting the evening air wash over her, reclaiming the space that had been violated. Tomorrow, she would call her attorney. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of holding accountable the people and the system that had allowed this to happen. Tomorrow, she would transform her personal humiliation into something larger, something that might protect others who didn't have her resources or her reputation. But tonight, she simply stood in her garden and remembered who she was. 3 weeks later, attorney Marcus Chun filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in the Northern District of Alabama. The complaint named Officer Brandon Mills as the primary defendant and the Maplewood Police Department as a co-defendant. The allegations were comprehensive: false arrest, excessive force, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and deliberate indifference to civil rights. The discovery process began immediately, and with it came the first of many revelations that would transform Dorothy's individual case into something far larger. Chen's team subpoenaed the dispatch logs from the afternoon of Dorothy's arrest. If Mills had responded to a call about suspicious activity, there would be a record. The dispatcher would have logged the incoming complaint, assigned the call, tracked the response. These records were sacrosanct in police work, the foundation of accountability and documentation. The logs showed nothing. No call had come in that afternoon regarding 4723 Magnolia Drive. No one had reported suspicious activity. No citizen had complained about an elderly woman planting flowers in a residential neighborhood. Brandon Mills had invented his justification entirely. The discovery of the fabricated dispatch call was damaging enough. But the real devastation came from what Chen's team found in Brandon Mills's personnel file from Georgia. The file arrived via subpoena, heavily redacted but still readable in the places that mattered. 4 formal complaints in 18 months, all from black men, all alleging racial profiling during traffic stops or pedestrian encounters. The first complaint described Mills stopping a black attorney walking to his office at 7 a.m., demanding identification and refusing to believe he worked in the building. The second involved a black grandfather picking up his grandchildren from school, surrounded by witnesses who watched Mills interrogate him for 15 minutes. The third and fourth followed similar patterns. Each complaint had triggered an internal investigation. Each investigation had been closed without action, citing insufficient evidence or conflicting accounts. But a pattern had emerged, clear enough that Mills's captain had finally documented his concerns in writing. Officer Mills demonstrates a consistent inability to apply reasonable suspicion standards without apparent racial bias. The captain had written, "I recommend termination with cause, based on the cumulative evidence of discriminatory policing practices." The department hadn't terminated Mills. They'd given him the option to resign, which he accepted. And 3 weeks later, he'd been hired by Maplewood without anyone ever reading the words his former captain had written. Chief Robert Hansen had conducted the interview personally. The hiring file showed no reference check beyond a criminal background search. Mills had no convictions, so Mills passed. The complaints, the investigations, the captain's recommendation, none of it appeared anywhere in the Maplewood records. Either Hansen hadn't asked, or he hadn't cared about the answers. This was bad for the department. But what came next was catastrophic. Investigative journalist Taylor Robinson had been covering criminal justice issues for the Birmingham Register for 8 years. When Dorothy Patterson's lawsuit was filed, Robinson recognized the potential for a larger story. One wrongful arrest was news. A pattern of wrongful arrests was an investigation. Robinson filed public records requests with the Maplewood Police Department, asking for arrest data broken down by race, location, and outcome. She requested internal communications regarding policing strategies. She requested training materials, performance evaluations, and policy memoranda. The department resisted at first, citing various exemptions and delays. But federal discovery rules in Dorothy's lawsuit created a parallel path, and Chen's team shared relevant documents with Robinson once they were entered into the court record. What emerged from those documents painted a picture that made national headlines. Over the previous 3 years, the Maplewood Police Department had made 47 arrests in the predominantly white neighborhoods on the north side of town. 43 of those arrests involved black or Latino individuals. Of those 43 arrests, 31 had been dismissed or thrown out due to lack of evidence or procedural violations. The numbers alone were damning. But the emails were worse. Chief Hansen had implemented an informal initiative he called Community Protection Sweeps. The program was never officially documented, never publicly announced, never subjected to oversight or review. It existed only in internal communications, in direct messages between Hansen and his officers, in casual references during roll call meetings. Pay special attention to individuals who seem out of place in residential areas, Hansen had written in one email. Our residents deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods. Maintaining neighborhood character is part of our mission. Another email was more explicit. If someone doesn't look like they belong, find a reason to make contact. Better to verify and be wrong than to let something slip past. The language was careful, never explicitly mentioning race. But the statistics told the truth the words tried to hide. In neighborhoods that were 89% white, 91% of the people stopped, questioned, and arrested were Black or Latino. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality was undeniable. Robinson's article ran on a Sunday, filling the front page of the Birmingham Register and spreading across wire services within hours. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by national outlets. By Tuesday, the Department of Justice announced it was opening an investigation into the Maplewood Police Department's policing practices. Dorothy Patterson's arrest hadn't been an isolated incident, the work of one rogue officer acting on personal prejudice. It had been the product of a system designed to produce exactly this outcome. Hansen had created the culture. Hansen had hired Mills without proper vetting. Hansen had sent officers into wealthy neighborhoods with implicit instructions to treat Black presence as inherently suspicious. 12 other victims came forward within a month of Robinson's article. Their stories echoed Dorothy's with haunting consistency. A Black nurse stopped while walking to her car after a night shift. A Black college student detained while visiting his grandmother. A Black businessman questioned while waiting for a client at a coffee shop. Each had been accused of not belonging, of being out of place, of existing where someone like them shouldn't exist. Most of them hadn't known others shared their experience. Most of them had blamed themselves, wondering what they'd done wrong, replaying the encounter in their minds and searching for the mistake that had drawn police attention. None of them had realized they were data points in a pattern, individual threads in a policy designed to criminalize their presence. Chen amended Dorothy's lawsuit to include class action claims on behalf of the other victims. The case was no longer about one retired judge arrested in her garden. It was about systematic civil rights violations, institutional racism, and the deliberate targeting of Black and Latino individuals in white neighborhoods. The Department of Justice investigation progressed in parallel with the civil case. Federal investigators interviewed dozens of officers, reviewed thousands of documents, and compiled a report that would eventually run over 200 pages. But the key findings were leaked to the press months before the official release. Maplewood had engaged in a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing, and Chief Robert Hansen bore direct responsibility for creating and maintaining that pattern. Hansen resigned before the report was published. He issued a statement expressing regret for any harm caused and denying any intentional wrongdoing. He was 53 years old with a full pension and no criminal charges pending. The system that had allowed him to build this machinery of discrimination would continue to provide for him in retirement. But the system was changing, slowly, painfully, in ways that mattered. The trial began on a crisp October morning, 8 months after Dorothy's arrest. The federal courthouse in Birmingham was packed with spectators, journalists, and the 12 other plaintiffs who had joined the class action. They sat in rows behind Dorothy, silent witnesses to a reckoning that had been too long delayed. Dorothy took the stand on the second day. She wore a navy blue suit, simple and dignified, the same style she'd worn during her years on the bench. Her hands were steady as she placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Her voice was clear as she began to speak. For 3 hours, she walked the jury through that afternoon. The weight of the sun on her back. The smell of fresh soil in her hands. The hymn she'd been humming, her mother's gift across the decades. She described the crunch of boots on gravel, the first demand to stand up, the growing realization of what was happening. She described the handcuffs closing around her wrists, the grass against her cheek, the soil she'd been planting in smeared across her face. 80 years old, face down on her own lawn, arrested for the crime of existing while Black in a neighborhood someone had decided didn't belong to her. The jury listened in absolute silence. Several members wiped their eyes. One elderly white woman in the back row lowered her head and didn't raise it again until Dorothy finished speaking. Mills's attorney attempted a cross-examination, but there was nothing to cross-examine. Dorothy's account was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by multiple witnesses and the physical evidence. The defense's theory, that Mills had acted reasonably based on the information available, collapsed under the weight of the fabricated dispatch call, the pattern of prior complaints, and the documented racism of the department's policing strategy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict in a steady voice. Liable on all counts. The damages, $2.3 million, to be divided among the plaintiffs based on the severity of their individual experiences. But the money was never the point. The Department of Justice report, released 3 weeks after the verdict, required the Maplewood Police Department to undergo complete restructuring. Mandatory bias training for all officers. New hiring protocols requiring thorough background investigations, including direct contact with previous employers. Body cameras for every officer, with footage subject to independent review. A civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. Officer Brandon Mills was terminated and permanently barred from law enforcement in the state of Alabama. His file, including the Georgia complaints and the circumstances of Dorothy's arrest, was entered into a national database designed to prevent problem officers from moving quietly from department to department. Chief Robert Hansen faced no criminal charges. The law, as currently written, made it nearly impossible to prosecute police executives for the policies they created, even when those policies resulted in systematic civil rights violations. This gap in accountability became a focus of Robinson's continuing coverage, and by the following year, the Alabama legislature had begun considering reforms. Dorothy used a portion of her settlement to establish the Patterson Foundation for Justice and Community Accountability. The foundation provided legal assistance to individuals who had experienced police misconduct but lacked the resources to fight back. In its first year, the foundation funded representation for 47 cases across Alabama and neighboring states. 18 of those cases resulted in settlements or verdicts for the plaintiffs. 2 years after her arrest, on a warm afternoon in early May, Dorothy returned to her garden on Magnolia Drive. The neighborhood had changed in subtle ways since that terrible day. The patrol car that passed her house now carried officers trained under new protocols, wearing body cameras that recorded every interaction. The chief who had replaced Hansen was a black woman with a reform background, brought in specifically to rebuild community trust. Dorothy knelt in the same spot where Mills had forced her to the ground. Her knees still protested, but the ache was familiar now, part of the rhythm of tending a garden at 82. She wore the same gardening gloves, still stained with soil from seasons of planting. In her hands she held begonia bulbs. White ones this time, symbols of gratitude and new beginnings. She pressed them into the earth one by one, spacing them exactly right, taking her time with each placement. The hymn came back to her, rising from somewhere deep, and she hummed it softly as she worked. Her mother's song, carried across generations, surviving every indignity the world could offer. Neighbors watched from their porches, but not with phones raised in fear this time. Martha Chin waved from across the street. Marcus Williams's children rode their bikes past, calling out greetings. Jerome the mail carrier slowed his truck and nodded, a small gesture of recognition between people who had witnessed something together and come out the other side. Dorothy planted the last bulb and pressed the soil firmly around it. She sat back on her heels and surveyed her work, the neat rows of white flowers that would bloom in the coming weeks. This garden had seen so much. 43 years of seasons, of growth and dormancy, of life and death and renewal. It had seen her at her lowest, face down in the grass while a stranger's knee pressed against her back. It had seen her at her strongest, refusing to let that moment define the rest of her story. She brushed the soil from her gloves and rose slowly to her feet. The afternoon sun hung heavy over Magnolia Drive, just as it had 2 years ago. But the shadows it cast were different now. Shorter. Less threatening. Dorothy Patterson walked back inside her home, leaving the garden to do what gardens do. In the soil, the white begonias waited for their moment to bloom.